Welcome to the Community Security Initiative's 2023 Tips on the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. As always, this presentation represents our best advice, and the final and last word goes to the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, and you can see their website here. You should always check back to our website at jcrc-ny.org/security grants and the DHSES website for the latest word. This is our table of contents page. Basically, there are 4 sections to this presentation. The first represents getting ready. The second is what you can do with your grant. The third and most important is the investment justification, how to do it, and finally, their scoring. Some people think that they can come up with their own questions and their own answers. We urge you to be creative, but carefully learn how to, rule number 1 is learn how to read and follow directions. That's every word on the investment justification and in other supplemental materials. And rule number 2 is there is no rule number 2. See rule number 1. If you've never won a nonprofit security grant, now's your chance. In 2021, only 31% of the eventual grantees were first-time applicants. In 2022, that jumped to 56%. That doesn't mean if you applied before you don't have a chance, but you're in good shape if you've never won before. The grant is due on April 20th, 2023 by 5 p.m. There are no excuses. You can't say the dog ate your homework or anything like that. If you don't get in a complete application by that date, your application will not be accepted. The application has to be submitted via the application called eGrants. A total of $305 million is available to organizations across the United States and the territories, half of which goes to the urban area grant. In New York State, New York City, Long Island, and Westchester, organizations are eligible for this grant, and every other area in New York State is eligible for the statewide grant. You have to be a 501c3 organization. Many different types of organizations are listed on this slide. There's more information available within the request for applications from New York State. If you have a single site, things are pretty straightforward. You can apply for one $150,000 grant for that site. If you have multiple sites with different addresses, you can apply for up to 3 grants at $150,000 per site. There's some other complications. I suggest that you read, if you have other situations, you read things carefully or submit a question to CSI_questions@jcrc-ny.org. You're going to need 2 website applications to submit your grant. The first is called Grants Gateway, or also known as your document vault. The website is listed here. And the second is called eGrants. More about both of these applications later. Use eGrants to pre-qualify in New York State. Organizations must be registered to compete for New York State grants. You fill out a registration form, and you email it to grants reform at its.ny.gov. They will send you an account sign-in and password and instruct you to upload certain documents such as your bylaws and various financial documents. If you registered for e-grants and you were pre-qualified in previous years, assume that your pre-qualification is expired. Check your account and see what has to be resubmitted. They're usually financial documents. You will be required eventually to obtain a unique identity ID, so you might as well do it right now. For more information, visit the website sam.gov/content/DUNS-UEI, and you can watch a YouTube on how to do it. Just a reminder, this is a reimbursement grant. That is, if you win a grant, you're going to have to lay out money and be reimbursed by the state. That doesn't take very long as you have all your ducks in a row. But UJA Federation has made it easier. They have created a security infrastructure loan fund at the Hebrew Free Loan Society. They will advance you a bridge loan and work with you to pay your vendors so that you don't waste any time getting your institution more secure. You will be required to submit a vulnerability assessment. And the vulnerability assessment identifies gaps in your security and things that keep your occupants, your visitors, your members, and your building safer. This document is the foundation of your application. Remember what I said about reading and following directions. On your vulnerability assessment, you must include the address for which the vulnerability assessment applies, the physical address. You want that to match the physical address provided in your work plan, of your e-grants application and your investment justification. You need a vulnerability assessment for every one of the projects that you're requesting, so that if you have 3 sites, you need 3 vulnerability assessments. And you want it to accurately and completely reflect the site's security vulnerabilities at the time of your application. So where can you get a vulnerability assessment? First and foremost, apply for one from the Community Security Initiative if you're in New York City, Long Island, Westchester, or Rockland. Here's the link, jcrc-ny.org/services-requests. You can also reach out to credentialed independent professionals, get a crime prevention survey from your local precinct. You can ask the Department of Homeland Security's protective security advisors to give you one, or there are self-assessment tools. Our advice, apply early, because people wake up and apply and we all run out of capacity. Here's an example of what the self-assessment for houses of worship from DHS looks like. So, what can you do with your grant dollars? Basically, most physical security measures like cameras, access control systems, alarms, bollards, barriers, upgrading your doors and windows. You can also get contract security and pay for some management and administration. There are things you cannot do. Here are some of the no-nos. You have the option to use part of your grant for contracted security. That means an outside security company, not additional organizational employees. They may not be used to purchase equipment for contracted security. And there's a technical requirement which has never been enforced, that the recipient must be able to sustain this capability in future years without an NSGP funding. These funds cannot be used to pay for local police coverage, but may be used if you do the proper bidding, if your local department has a program such as the NYPD Paid Detail Unit. Consider using funds for cybersecurity, such as remote authentication, encryption, malware, antivirus protection, firewalls, etc. You can use NSGP funds for planning. You can use nonprofit security grant funds for planning, training, drills, and exercises, so long as they are pre-approved by New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. Up to 5% of the grant can be used to pay for someone to keep track of costs and paperwork for New York State. And that can be paid to for overtime for an existing employee, or for an outside person. It cannot be part of a employee's usual work week. So you can buy a lot of things for your $150,000, but we recommend that you don't bite off more than you can chew. Remember that you're required to contract for equipment and services according to New York State rules. There are lots of rules and steps to follow. So remember that you're going to have to do that. You'll have to get bids from multiple vendors for each category of equipment, guards, planning, and training. The government doesn't approve your hardware installation. Their job is to make sure you follow the rules. It's up to you to think, design, and select. Thinking about your needs now and will make your life easier when you're a grantee. Some organizations have won grants for new doors, access control, cameras, and blast mitigation, and found that the bidding involved for the 4 different categories is overly daunting. So you don't have to apply for the full $150,000. There are going to be additional state grants and federal grants. You should limit your projects to the number you can handle. And if you need help, reach out to your CSI, Regional Security Director. Here's the address: services requests at JCRC-NY.org. Download your 2023 investment justification. Here's the link. If you use last year's application, it will not be accepted. Some people have had trouble opening the investment justification. If you do, here are instructions to follow. Please follow them directly before you ask for help. The investment justification is the core of your application. Remember, you can only do one site per physical, one physical location per address per investment justification. You must occupy the location at the time. In other words, on April 20th, you must be using that site for the intended use. If you're under construction, that does not qualify. The investment justification summarizes your mission, your vulnerability, and helps the judges get an idea of what you're doing and what you need. And this is the only document that gets submitted to Washington, and for the judges there to be able to make a judgment about your organization and your need. Approximately 70% of the investment justification is devoted to identifying and developing a plan that addresses your risks, and 30% shows that you know how to implement your plan. The first part of the investment justification is background. First section is very straightforward on page 1. They want your name and your address. They ask you, do you own, lease, or rent your site? It's a drop-down box. You just choose one if you're leasing or renting. They want to know, do you have the owner's permission to make proposed security enhancements? Unfortunately, some people have gotten grants in past years, and their landlord said, no, you can't do that. And so the grant is wasted. At the time of the application, you must be actively occupying and functioning out of the location listed. Remember, we mentioned that only one nonprofit can apply per building facility or a physical structure or address. But it can be that a security upgrade of a building, for example, a synagogue that also houses a school, both you harden the primary and secondary doors, both organizations benefit. Lighting in the parking lot benefits both organizations. So that's how you answer this first question. The second question is for your mission statement. You don't have a lot of words. This is your only opportunity to help the federal judges to understand what your organization does. And they recommend that, actually it's required that you also upload a copy of your mission statement, ideally on letterhead. Your primary organization type, it's a drop-down. You get the most points if you're ideology-based, spiritual, religious, any house of worship, any religious school fits into the first category. If your organization does not have a mission statement, here's some tips on where to find more information. Page 2 includes 2 drop-down options. One to select the function that best describes your organization, and the second is to describe your primary affiliation. In other words, what religion. These are used for classification and informational purposes. Moving on to the bottom of page 7. Are you a charitable organization? The IRC in Internal Revenue Code specifies all houses of worship are automatically 501c3 organizations. Most of you would say yes. Do you have this unique entity ID? There's a slide on that, how to get it, how to get more information. It's either yes or no. And are you physically located in the current urban area security initiative designated urban area? New York City, Long Island, Westchester, and Westchester organizations are. And then, so just pull down and go to New York. And total federal funding requested. Don't worry about filling that out. It's automatically calculated by the template. Moving on to page 3 of the investment justification. The question is, please describe the location's symbolic value. Now, if applicable, the key phrases, if applicable, describe your organization, its mission, purpose, the symbolic value of the site as a highly recognized national or historical institution, or, and not every organization has national or historical significance, or as a significant institution within the community. And that includes your congregation or your school, how you help the parents, that renders the site as a possible target of terrorism or other extremist attacks. For example, is your building landmarked, have distinctive architecture, or on a major street? Do you have prominent leaders, members? Remember, do not leave this blank because then you lose points. Now, then it asks you what your role in a prevention, protection, response, and/or recovery. For example, you may have your work with CSI may have be part of your role in a terrorist attack. If you have taken courses with the Red Cross, something like, or your members volunteer with the Red Cross, that works too. And these are the questions that you answer, and try to be as complete as possible within the limited space allotted. What is risk? Risk is the potential for an adverse outcome, and it's basically a combination of what your threat is, what your vulnerability is, and what the consequences are. And the nonprofit security grant investment justification asks you to clarify all those situations. And they make up a huge 15 points out of 40. Now, what's threat? That's the first element that we're talking about of risk. It's an indication of potential harm to life information operations, the environment, or property. And you can have natural threats, technological threats, and human-caused threats. This is a chart from FEMA's Comprehensive Preparedness Guide. And what we advise you do is to figure out how to protect against likely, and we emphasize the word likely, terrorist or extremist-based threats. So this chart is from the Comprehensive Preparedness Guide. It lists all kinds of human-caused threats, which you can worry about, but the likely ones are active shooter incidents, armed assault, cyber attack against data, or explosives. Now, what I do is I added to their list 3 likely threats: vandalism, arson, or vehicle ramming. All of these are things that you have to talk about and protect against. When talking about risk, the first thing you should think about is what happened to you. That could be listed on a previously conducted risk vulnerability assessment, including those from Community Security Initiative, police reports, insurance claims for incidents that did happen. Has your organization or your leadership received phone, email, social media, or mailed threats? Have you been vandalized or worse? Now, you should be talking about what is current. While historic risk may be included for context, the investment justification should focus on current threats and risks. So what does that mean? If you didn't have something there, you should be talking about what happened locally or worldwide, but talk about a closely related organization, a similar organization, or a nearby organization. Things like active shooters using sharp-edged weapons, explosive devices, arson, mail, and package attempts. So you should be making the connection that you are at risk for the very same reason. So, for example, what happened in November, CSI identified a plot against synagogues in Manhattan. This is exactly what you should be pointing to. That's a current threat. 2 individuals were arrested that wanted to shoot up a synagogue or people arriving to worship there. And that's a threat that you should be thinking of. Another threat came from the National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin. that says the targets of potential violence include going through the list: schools, religious minorities, government facilities, faith-based institutions. That includes most of us. So you can cite that also. Vulnerability. That refers to a physical or operational feature that leaves you or your organization, your facility, open to destruction, incapacitation, or exploitation by a terrorist or an extremist attack. Now, what you want to do is to clearly describe those gaps. They can be lack of or weak physical protective measures. They can be lack of adequate access control or insufficient screening, lack of hardware to support sound security policies, or a lack of plans. Here are some examples of some language you can use describing the vulnerabilities and what could be the possible outcomes. In the quest to score the maximum point value possible, there are some magic words. How do you describe what can help protect against threats and mitigate vulnerabilities? First of all, some of FEMA's magic words include interdiction and disruption. For example, upgraded doors and windows will delay an attack, divert an attack, intercept an attack, halt an attack. All of those are good. What kind of screening and metal detectors help with screening, search, and detection. Physical protection measures, again, delay, divert, intercept, halt, apprehend, or secure threats and or hazards. And on-scene security, contracted security will help you, and you'll notice this in our examples, will help you provide screening and effectively control access to your building. Consequences. Again, when you're talking about consequences, you want to talk about the 4 types of consequences that FEMA identifies: the human consequences, the human toll, the economic toll. And the human toll could be injury and loss of life. Economic could be damage to your physical plant, your mission. If you cannot hold services or you cannot hold classes in your building, how does that affect your mission? And psychological, what does that do to your what's the psychological impact on your congregation or your parent body? If there's an attack, remember in Sandy Hook, that attack didn't make the building physically unusable, but it was psychologically unusable. There may be other factors such as an impact on environment. Facility hardening, page 4 of 7. You're getting toward the end. This has 2 sections, and it's 9 points out of 40. And it's highly redundant, but make sure that you fill it out. It asks for specific vulnerabilities. Remember we talked about specific vulnerabilities a few slides ago, and magic words. You use those magic words, and they ask for a cost estimate. So, for example, for fencing. For fencing, you want to address the vulnerability and prevent or delay breaching along the west side of the facility. If the fence is on the west side of the facility, A physical protective measure, that's a second set of magic words. 240 feet of 8-foot chain link fencing, topped with a foot of barbed wire. Then there's the math, and it totals $50,000. Again, these are estimates. You don't have to be spot on. You're going to have to get bids down the line. Here's another example with cameras. And then the form asks you to fill in the AEL number. That's the authorized equipment list. Everything is right here. It used to be that you had to go look it up. If you're getting lights, that means that you just check off 14SW01LITE, the vulnerability to be addressed. You go back to the vulnerability in the previous section, and the estimated funding requested, round to the nearest dollar. It's basically the same information as above, but they're making you fit everything into categories so they can do record keeping and analysis. Now we move from what you want and why you want it to a justification of whether you can really handle a grant of this magnitude. After all, the government is giving you $150,000. They want to know you know how to spend it wisely. The government is giving you $150,000, and they want you to know that you know what you're doing and you can spend the money wisely. So this talks about, what your resources are and your bandwidth. Now, the first option is milestones. There are 10 blanks here. They already filled in the first blank, which is environmental planning and historical preservation review. That's, I filled in the start and the completion date, which are reasonable if you really are on top of things. By the time you get all the forms and it's after the high holidays, you'll only start doing your environmental planning and historical preservation screener in October, and it will take you a few months to get the answer. Remember, the next step is to get do everything necessary to get a New York State contract. So again, that starts at in, let's say, September 2023, and you get a contract after you do you get approved for environmental planning and historical preservation. So say February 2024. Remember, those overlap. Overlap is natural in any large project. Remember, there are some things you can't do before you do other things. You can't install the lock on a door before you install the door. That's an example. So examples that should be in these 10 steps: signing a contract, creating bid documents, soliciting bids, evaluating and rewarding bids, and do all the appropriate reporting for New York Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. Can you manage this project? They want to know who will manage the project, and they need the name, phone number, email address, and generally the experience of project managers. So the question is, have you or someone on your team done a project of this size before? Also, there's another assess your project management plan approach. Figure out how to describe any challenges to the effective implementation. For example, if you're a school, you don't want construction during school hours. You're going to try to schedule construction during the summer or during vacations. There are still supply chain issues that could impede the installation. Cash flow, your ability to get. Remember, I mentioned way back the Hebrew Free Loan Security Infrastructure Loan. So, if you have cash flow problems, those are all possible. You want to fully justify the effectiveness of the proposed management team. So if you don't have a lot of construction management experience, do you have someone on your board who's in real estate, who's done this kind of thing? A lawyer, an accountant, people in insurance. Those kind of people have done this, and it's good to talk about a management team and include how you will coordinate with your state and local Homeland Security partners. Remember, you're going to do that. You're going to coordinate with the DHSCS program rep. So what do they mean by impact? Well, they have very specific definitions: sample outcomes and sample outputs. The outcomes that you can measure are, as an example, and that's a measurable 100% of our primary and secondary doors will withstand an assault by a determined intruder for at least 10 minutes. In other words, you've upgraded all of your doors. That, is an outcome. All of your windows will be filmed and anchored through this grant so that the injury to inhabitants by flying glass is minimized. They also ask for performance metrics, and that is defined in the documentation, and it talks about the percentage of funding spent on contract security, percentage of funding spent on facility hardening, and the percentage of funding spent on training and awareness. As we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, groups that have never received a grant get an extra 15 points. We also mentioned that if you're mission-based, at risk because of your mission, your scores will be multiplied by 3. They'll be doubled if you're a medical or educational institution. There's a bonus for 15 points for underserved communities. You should note that there were no underserved communities that received bonuses in New York, in the New York urban area last year. Don't worry about the perfect score because no one can get it, but do as well as you can. On that note, you're asked if you've ever received a federal grant in the past. That's since 2007. You click on the most recent option. And if yes, talk about the projects and investments. My working assumption is that, for example, if you received a grant for cameras 10 years ago, it's certainly time to replace those cameras. So you might have a higher priority if you have an older grant or equipment that wears out, as opposed to a door, which is basically a long-term investment. Finally, here's how to contact the Community Security Initiative and how to contact the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, as well as get help for Grants Gateway. These are the contact numbers. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I thank everyone who's stayed on this long to listen to the drone of my voice, and we hope it's helpful. Any further questions? Just email CSI_questions at JCRC-NY.org.